For this video, I decided to explore the phrase, no taxation without representation, and whether it is predominantly a question of the injustice of taxation or the lack of representation that prompted the American Revolution. From what I read, it appears that the war started not entirely from issues of taxes or representation, but rather from opposing views on the distribution of power. My first primary source that I read is Daniel Dulaney the Younger's Considerations on the Propriety of Imposing Taxes in the British Colonies for the Purpose of Raising Revenue by the Act of Parliament, written in 1765 in response to the Stamp Act. As a moderate loyalist and politician in Maryland, he was able to describe the British position in order to refute it. As a teacher, I always find it interesting to see students who might be related to important individuals. And I used to be a teacher in Maryland, and I had a student with the last name of Dulaney, but I wasn't able to make that connection. I also did once have a student with the last name Eisenhower, and I was able to make that connection and ask her if she was related to President Eisenhower, which of course she was. But anyway, the British thought that the colonials were virtually represented, that they might not be actually represented in regards to geographical location, but they were virtually represented rather by class. That the people in America were represented by the people in the House of Commons, and that the aristocracy in America was represented by the aristocracy in the House of Lords. Dulaney described, the electors, who are inseparably connected in their interests with the non-electors, may be justly deemed to be the representatives of the non-electors. However, Dulaney argued that the best form of representation was actually at the local government level, where they had the largest say in affairs. He stressed the difference between regulating trade and raising taxes. He wrote, a right to impose an internal tax on the colonies without their consent for the single purpose of revenue is denied. A right to regulate their trade without their consent is admitted. My second primary source is John Dickinson's Letters from a Farmer in Pennsylvania, written in 1767 in response to the Townshend Acts, which was a tax on the importation of paper, paint, lead, glass, and tea. Dickenson was also a politician, and in his thoughts was even more radical than Dulaney, but he was still opposed to independence. However, this did not stop him from writing a series of 12 letters that started with "My dear countrymen" and ended with simply "a farmer." These essays were widely read throughout the colonies in newspapers and pamphlets. Unlike the direct or internal tax in the Stamp Act, now the British thought an indirect or external tax hidden in imports would stand well with the colonials. But Dickenson argued that the colonials should pay no taxes at all to British Parliament, whether direct or indirect. Dickenson saw that the precedent of paying even a small amount would then logically extend to the right of British Parliament to tax large amounts. Dickenson wrote, in short, if they have a right to levy a tax of 1 penny upon us, they have a right to levy 1,000,000 upon us. For where does that right stop? To attempt to limit their right after granting it to exist at all is as contrary to reason as granting it to exist is as contrary to justice. Thus, in total, the colonials were not opposed to a small amount of taxation for purposes such as defense, justice, or local civil government, nor did they wish to be represented in British Parliament directly, but rather they saw taxation as a matter of local government where one was best represented. In regards to pedagogy, I always thought that a unique project would be to have students orate a famous speech, and one could also do it with famous pamphlets such as Dickinson's Letters of a Farmer from Pennsylvania, or Thomas Paine's Common Sense. I also find recitation to be a forgotten tool that can actually help improve one's memory skills. I remember I had to recite the preamble to the Constitution and a French song in middle school, as well as, of course, the Pledge of Allegiance. I also think it's a good idea for Christians to memorize the Lord's Prayer and the Apostles' Creed, for example. So teachers could have their students memorize an important part of these letters. Another use of the primary source in the classroom could be reading a selected passage slowly in order to reflect upon that passage, in order to look at its significance. Moreover, the two works are excellent primary sources for a research paper in a seminar class. For information literacy, a teacher could have their students further explore historical examples that Dickenson uses. He made references to Carthage, the Spartans, Caesar, Nero, and British kings. So your students could research those and further understand what Dickenson was trying to say. Another way to improve information literacy would be to have students explore footnotes. For example, Dickenson says, "If Great Britain can order us to come to her for necessaries we want, and can order us to pay what taxes she pleases, we are as abject slaves as France and Poland can show in wooden shoes and with uncombed hair." And I, of course, had no clue what Dickenson meant by wooden shoes and uncombed hair. So I looked at the footnote, and I saw the reference which said, "The peasants of France wear wooden shoes, and the vassals of Poland are remarkable for matted hair which can never be combed." So it sort of made an understanding of what he was referencing. This also involved the use of new technology. Since I read it in PDF format, it was hyperlinked, so I was able to click on that hyperlink and it took me directly to that endnote. Another way you could ensure students to incorporate information literacy, you could ensure students do a background research on such matters such as the Stamp Act. There was not a tax imposed on stamps as we know it today, but rather a tax on paper, which first had to be stamped in England, and the colonials were required to use that paper. Unfortunately, today we have all but given up on the economic liberty as seen by Dulaney and Dickenson, where government interference in the economy is all too common, especially within the federal government, and especially among democratic socialists, representatives who think they can vastly increase taxes, and in so doing their own power, simply because they were elected.